The wind screamed across the mountains like a beast loose from its chains, carrying with it snow so sharp it sliced the skin. The storm had not stopped for 2 days, and the wilderness had become a prison of white, swallowing the trails, erasing the paths, and leaving only endless drifts and jagged ridges. In that blinding fury of ice and sky, a woman stumbled forward, one hand pressed against her leg where blood had long since frozen into her torn dress. Every step was agony, but she forced her weight down, dragging herself onward because behind her trailed a child, a girl no older than 8, barefoot, thin as a reed, her dark hair stiff with ice, her lips purple, but her eyes refusing to close. The mother dared not stop. She knew if she did, the storm would finish what the bandits had begun. Hours ago, or was it days, she had fled the trail with her daughter, limping into the mountains to escape men who had torn apart her small camp. They had killed her husband months earlier when he refused to work longer hours on the railroad. Since then she had hidden, moving from place to place, surviving on scraps, carrying her daughter through towns where eyes narrowed at the sight of them. Tonight, her body cried for rest, but she pressed on because she feared what waited if she faltered. She told herself, again and again, that there had to be shelter somewhere. Somewhere. The girl clutched her mother's sleeve, silent, not daring to complain. Her breath rattled, but her little legs moved in rhythm, carrying her forward through snow that reached to her knees. She had learned silence early. It was safer that way. Yet she glanced at her mother's face, and in her wide eyes was a question, unspoken but desperate. How much farther? The woman had no answer. She whispered instead, voice hoarse, hold on, just a little more. Then, through the swirl of snow, a shadow emerged, a shape half hidden among towering pines. The mother blinked, thinking at first it was another trick of the storm. But as the gust shifted, the outline sharpened into the rough geometry of man-made lines. A roof buried under snow, a crooked chimney, a cabin crouched low against the mountain's wrath. Relief nearly buckled her knees. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hand and hobbled faster, her heart pounding with hope and dread, because she knew that sometimes a door could mean salvation, and sometimes it could mean rejection. The cabin loomed closer. Smoke rose in faint curls from the chimney, proof of life. That meant someone was inside. That meant warmth, but also danger. She knew how men looked at her, how they whispered slurs she didn't fully understand but felt like knives. She knew how suspicion lingered on her face, her accent, her child's skin. Still, she had no choice. She could not let her daughter die in the snow. She reached the door, her legs threatening to give. Her fist, trembling, struck the wood 3 times. For a moment, nothing. The storm howled as though mocking her. She knocked again, weaker now, then leaned her forehead against the rough planks, whispering, please. Inside, heavy boots scraped against the floor. A latch slid, wood groaned, and the door cracked open. A man filled the frame. He was tall, shoulders broad beneath a wool fur coat, hair long and tangled, beard streaked with gray. His eyes, pale as winter sky, narrowed at the sight of them. In one hand, he held a rifle, barrel angled downward but ready. His face was carved in stone, unreadable, neither welcoming nor cruel, but marked by years of solitude. The woman straightened, summoning strength she did not have, and forced the words past her dry lips. Can we stay 1 night? Her voice cracked, raw with desperation. She stepped slightly aside so he could see the child at her side, hoping the sight of smallness, of innocence, might soften the hardness in his gaze. For a long moment, the man said nothing. The snow hissed against the cabin walls, the storm raging around them. The girl clutched her mother tighter, staring up at the stranger with wide, unblinking eyes. The man's gaze shifted between them, weighing, calculating. He did not lower the rifle. The silence stretched until the mother feared she might collapse there at his feet. She felt the warmth of blood soaking her bandage, smelled the iron tang rising beneath the stench of sweat and smoke. She whispered again, weaker, please, just 1 night. The man's jaw worked, grinding against some thought he did not speak. Finally, his voice rumbled out, deep and rough from disuse. Where do you come from? She hesitated. To tell him was to open wounds she could not bear, but to say nothing might seal their fate. We ran. Bad men. They hurt us. We have nowhere. His eyes narrowed further, studying her torn dress, her limp, the child's bare feet. The rifle shifted, but he did not raise it. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his presence filling the doorway like a wall. "You don't belong here." Her heart sank. She felt her daughter's small body press against her leg, hiding from his stare. The storm clawed at her back, threatening to drag them away if the door shut again. Her lips trembled as she forced the plea one final time. "If not for me, for her. She will not last till morning." Something flickered in the man's eyes, something almost human, buried deep beneath layers of distrust. He looked at the child again, and for the first time his grip on the rifle eased. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the shriek of the wind. Then, slowly, he stepped back. The door creaked wider. The mother gasped, relief washing over her like warmth. But before she could move, his voice cut the air again. "One night. No more." She nodded quickly, clutching her daughter's hand, pulling her inside. The storm roared behind them as a man shut the door with a final thud, sealing them into the dim light of the cabin. Heat from a small fire licked at her frozen skin, making her shiver with a sudden return of feeling. She sagged against the wall, nearly collapsing. The man said nothing more. He set the rifle against the table, though his eyes never left them. The child huddled close to her mother, gazing at the fire as though it were a miracle. The woman tried to whisper thanks, but her voice broke, swallowed by exhaustion. The mountain man watched, his face still a mask, but deep inside something stirred, an old ache, a memory of another storm, another small hand once held, now lost. He crushed it down, unwilling to feel, unwilling to remember. These strangers were trouble. One night, he told himself. Only one. Yet even as he thought it, he could not shake the image of the girl's eyes, silent, desperate, unbroken. The storm outside screamed, battering the cabin, but inside, a fragile tension hung heavier than the wind. 3 souls, thrown together by fate, circled by mistrust, bound by need. And the night was only just beginning. The fire crackled low, shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. The mother lowered herself onto the wooden floor, her wounded legs stretched out before her, blood seeping slowly through the ragged cloth she had tied hours ago. The child curled close against her, small fingers reaching toward the warmth of the flames, though her eyes never strayed far from a man who had opened his door to them. He sat across the room at a crude table, a knife in hand, whittling slowly at a block of wood, every stroke deliberate, every glance toward them sharp with suspicion. His rifle leaned within reach, never out of sight, as though he expected at any moment that the 2 frozen strangers in his home might turn on him. The mother drew a breath, trying to steady herself, trying to push back the pain gnawing at her leg. She had been in rooms like this before, on the edges of settlements, in bunkhouses and back alleys where men eyed her like an intruder, where silence was safer than speech. But this man's silence carried weight of its own, thick as the smoke rising from the chimney. She whispered to her daughter, telling her to rest, that the storm outside would not reach them here, though in her own heart the words felt uncertain. The man finally spoke, his voice low and harsh, as though unused a conversation. "You'll leave when the sun rises." She nodded quickly, willing to agree to anything. "Yes, we only ask, just until morning." His knife paused against the wood, eyes narrowing again. Men don't usually wander these mountains in a storm, not unless they are running from something. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet the steel of his stare. "We had no choice." He grunted, the sound neither sympathetic nor cruel, but his gaze lingered longer this time, studying the dirt on her hands, the cracked skin, the hollow cheeks of the child. Something in that look carried judgment, yet also something restrained, as if he recognized a mark of desperation. The child broke the silence, her small voice trembling but steady. "Mama's hurt." The mother hushed her quickly, stroking her hair, but the words had already reached him. His eyes shifted to the wound, to the dark stain spreading across the cloth. His brow furrowed, though his mouth gave nothing away. Setting down the knife, he rose and crossed the room. The mother stiffened, instinctively wrapping her arms around the girl as he loomed closer. He crouched, his presence filling the space with the weight of the wilderness itself, and without asking permission he examined the leg. She flinched at his touch but did not pull away. She could not afford pride when survival hung by a thread. The wound was deep, though not fresh. His eyes lifted to Hayes, unreadable. Then he moved to a shelf and pulled down a small jar of salve and a strip of clean cloth. He returned, wordless, and began to wake, cleaning the wound with a roughness that made her wince, but with enough care that she realized he was not intent on cruelty. When he bound it tight, she whispered, "Thank you." He stood without answering, moving back to his place by the fire. The act had been practical, not kind. At least that was what he told himself. He could not watch someone bleed on his floor. It was as simple as that. Yet something in the quiet gratitude of her voice unsettled him more than the storm outside. Time passed, marked only by the shifting logs in the fire and the distant howl of wind. The girl fell asleep against her mother's lap, her chest rising and falling with fragile steadiness. The man's knife returned to its steady scraping, carving away with until the block began to take shape. The mother, her strength slowly returning with the heat, studied him through the wavering light. His face was lined, weather-beaten, carrying scars that told of battles with more than storms. He looked like the mountains themselves, unforgiving, immovable, cowed by loss and endurance. She wondered what story had driven him here, alone at the edge of the world, with only silence for company. When she spoke, it was tentative. "You live here alone." His eyes flicked to her, then back to the wood. "Better that way." She nodded faintly, understanding more than he realized. Sometimes, being among people is harder than the wilderness. For a moment, the knife paused, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He said nothing, but in that silence was the echo of his own memory, faces once alive now gone, laughter long buried under earth and snow. He shoved the thought aside, carving harder, as though each stroke could chip away the ghosts. The mother leaned her head back against the wall, exhaustion pressing down on her. Yet sleep would not come. Her thoughts churned with fear of what lay beyond dawn, whether the men who had hunted her still searched the valleys, whether the mountains would claim them before safety could be found. She looked at her daughter, fragile and resilient all at once, and swore again that she would endure whatever it took. The storm battered on, relentless. Hours slipped away, the fire burning low. Then, a sound outside, a faint crunch in the snow, subtle but unmistakable. The man's head lifted, his hand reaching instantly for the rifle. The mother stiffened, clutching her child closer. Another crunch, nearer now, followed by a low growl. "Wolves," he muttered, moving to the door. The girl stirred awake at the word, eyes wide with fear. The mother soothed her quickly, whispering that it was nothing, though her own heart raced. She had heard the tales of wolves in these mountains, starving packs that prowl the edges of cabins, emboldened by hunger. The man unbarred the door and stepped out into the storm, rifle raised. Snow whipped around him, but his eyes pierced the dark, scanning the tree line. Shapes moved between the drifts, low and sleek, glowing eyes catching the faint firelight from inside. A snarl split the wind, sharp and hungry. He leveled the rifle and fired. The shot cracked like thunder, echoing through the forest. A yelp followed, and the shadows retreated, scattering into the night. He stood there a moment longer, the storm clawing at his coat, then lowered the rifle and returned inside, shutting the door hard against the cold. His expression was grim, but calm, as though this was nothing new. He set the weapon down and resumed his seat, as if the danger had been only a passing inconvenience. The mother whispered, "Thank you," again, but this time her voice carried more weight, a deeper sincerity. He glanced at her, then at the child, who was still trembling but alive, safe. Something shifted in his chest, a pressure he had long buried. He reached to the pot simmering above the fire and ladled a small portion into a wooden bowl. Without a word, he placed it on the floor before the girl. Her eyes widened, and she looked to her mother for permission. At her nod, the child lifted the bowl, sipping cautiously. The warmth spread through her small body, and for the first time in days, a faint smile touched her lips. The man returned to his place, but the act lingered in the air like a fragile bridge. The mother saw it, recognized it for what it was, not pity, not obligation, but a quiet gesture of humanity breaking through the stone. Hours passed, the storm easing at last. The cabin grew still, the only sound the crackle of fire and the steady breaths of the sleeping child. The mother fought to stay awake, unwilling to close her eyes under the roof of a stranger, yet exhaustion claimed her at last. The man sat long into the night, staring at the flames, listening to the rhythm of their breathing. Against his will, Memories crept back, of another child once asleep by a fire, a voice once soft in his cabin, laughter that had long since vanished into the earth. His chest tightened, and he gripped the carving harder. When he looked down, he saw what his hands had made, the shape of a bird, wings stretched as though ready to take flight. He set it on the table, staring at it as though it accused him. He told himself again, firmly, that when the sun rose, they would leave. His life was not theirs to share. Yet as he glanced toward the girl curled against her mother, he felt the truth pressing against him. The storm outside was not the only one he had let inside these walls. The first light of dawn crept over the mountains, pale and cold, breaking through the clouds at last. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, the strangers slept, and the mountain man sat in silence, torn between the solitude he had clung to and the fragile trust that had begun to thaw the ice around his heart. And he knew, though he would not yet admit it, that when morning came, nothing would be the same. The pale dawn stretched across the mountains like a blade of silver, cutting through the remnants of the storm. The cabin was still, smoke rising lazily from the chimney, the smell of wood and ash clinging to the air. Inside, the mother stirred first, her eyes blinking open to the dim glow of dying embers. For a moment she did not know where she was, only that her daughter's small body was warm against her side. Then memory returned. The storm, the cabin, the mountain man who had let them in with conditions sharp as steel. She sat up slowly, wincing as her leg throbbed, her gaze sliding toward the figure by the window. He had not slept. He stood there, tall and unyielding, watching the horizon as though it were an enemy. The rifle rested against the wall within his reach. His expression was carved from stone, but something in the set of his shoulders betrayed unease. When he noticed her stirring, his eyes met hers briefly, then returned to the world outside. "It's morning," he said, voice rough from disuse. "You should go." The words, though expected, struck her with the weight of exile. She pulled her daughter close, brushing the child's hair back with trembling fingers. "The storm is still strong," she whispered. "The trail." "You said one night," he cut in, not unkind but firm, "and I keep my word. But so should you." Her chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to plead for just a little longer, but the look on his face warned her there would be no bending him. Not yet. She nodded instead, swallowing the ache, and began to gather what little they had. The girl rubbed her eyes, still drowsy, confusion filling her gaze as her mother urged her to stand. Before they could move to the door, a sound shattered the morning stillness, distant at first, then nearer, the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen earth. The man stiffened, head snapping toward the sound, rifle in hand before another breath had passed. The mother froze, terror surging through her veins, for she knew that sound, had dreaded it in every waking hour since fleeing. The boots drew closer, more than one pair, heavy and purposeful. Voices followed, rough laughter carried on the cold air. The man glanced at her, and in her eyes he saw recognition, fist sharpened to a blade. He did not ask. He already knew. Trouble had followed them here. The girl clung to her mother, trembling, as the voices grew louder. Then came the pounding on the door, fists like thunder against the wood. "Open up!" a voice barked, thick with cruelty. "We know you're in there." The mountain man's jaw tightened, his grip steady on the rifle. He moved to the door, but the mother reached for him, her voice a broken whisper. "Please, they're the ones. They'll kill us." His pale eyes locked on Hayes, and for a heartbeat something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that this was no longer about shelter or storms. He gave a single nod, then motioned her and the child toward the corner, behind the table. She obeyed, pulling her daughter down beside her, shielding her with her own body. The door rattled again. "Don't make us break it down, old man." The mountain man's voice rang out, calm and steady. "This is my land. You've no business here." Laughter answered, cruel and mocking. "We've business with the woman you're hiding. Hand her over, and maybe we'll let you live." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. Then the man said, his voice like the snap of a frozen branch, "No one's handed over." The cabin erupted into violence. The door splintered inward under the weight of boots and shoulders, snow swirling in with the intruders. 3 men stormed inside, faces twisted with malice, weapons drawn, knives, pistols, hunger in their eyes. The mountain man was already moving, rifle raised. The first shot cracked through the air, deafening in the enclosed space. One intruder fell back, blood staining the snow that blew in behind him. The others roared, firing wildly. Wood splintered. Smoke filled the cabin. The girl's scream muffled against her mother's chest. The mountain man ducked behind the table, reloading with practiced speed. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his coat, but he did not flinch. He rose, fired again, dropping the second man where he stood. The last attacker lunged forward, knife gleaming, too close for the rifle to matter. They collided, bodies crashing against the wall, the knife slashing dangerously near. The man's strength was immense, his rage feral, but the mountain man fought with the desperation of someone defending more than himself. They grappled, fists and steel, the cabin shaking with their struggle. The mother, heart pounding, saw the knife rise high. Without thought, without hesitation, she snatched a piece of firewood from the hearth and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the attacker's temple, just enough to stagger him. The mountain man seized the opening, wrenching the knife from his hand and driving it deep. The man collapsed, lifeless, at his feet. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breaths of the living. Blood pooled on the floor, seeping into the cracks of the wood. The mother clutched her daughter, shaking, her own breath coming in sobs she could not contain. The mountain man stood over the bodies, chest heaving, eyes distant as though staring into ghosts. When at last he turned, his gaze met hers. No words were spoken, but in that look was an acknowledgment that survival had bound them together, that in that moment their fates had entwined. She had fought beside him, and he had defended them. The fragile ice of trust had cracked, giving way to something stronger. He cleaned the blood from his hands, his movements mechanical, but his eyes kept drifting to the girl, who now peered at him with something like awe instead of fear. The mother rose shakily, leaning on the table for support. "You saved us," she whispered. He shook his head, voice low. "You saved yourselves." The days stretched long after that, silence heavy over the cabin. They buried the bodies in the frozen earth, side by side, with no word spoken. The work was brutal, but it steadied them, each strike of the shovel against the ground a release of what lingered inside. By dusk, the graves were covered, the snow already reclaiming the mounds as its own. Back inside, the mother sat by the fire, her daughter nestled against her, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The man sat across from them, the carving of the bird still on the table between them. He stared at it for a long while, then pushed it across the wood toward the girl. She picked it up, turning it in her small hands, and for the first time she smiled fully, light breaking through the shadows. The mother's throat tightened. She looked at him, searching for words, but he lifted a hand, shaking his head. "No thanks. No debts. Tomorrow you move on." Her heart sank, though she had expected nothing else. She knew he carried his own pain, his own solitude like armor. To ask more of him would be to ask him to tear open wounds he had buried long ago. Still, she could not help the ache in her chest, the wish for something different. That night, as the fire burned low, she lay awake, watching him across the room. He sat as always, silent, watching the flames, a sentinel in his own exile. And she thought then that he was like the mountains, enduring, unyielding, but carrying within him a strength that had saved them when nothing else could. Morning came, clear and cold, the storm finally broken. The sky stretched wide, the peaks shining with new snow. She gathered her few belongings, her leg bound tighter now, her daughter bundled in scraps of cloth for warmth. At the door, she turned to him. "We will not forget." He said nothing, only handed her a small bundle of food, provisions enough for the trail ahead. His eyes lingered on the child once more, then on her, and in them she saw what words could not carry, a respect earned, a bond unspoken. She bowed her head, a gesture of gratitude deeper than language, then stepped into the snow. The girl followed, clutching the carved bird in her hand. Together they moved down the trail, their figures growing smaller against the vastness of white. The mountain man stood in the doorway, watching until they disappeared into the trees. The silence of the wilderness closed around him again, but it was changed, filled now with the echo of voices, with a memory of small hands and desperate courage. He closed the door slowly, turning back to the fire, and though he told himself life would return to what it had been, he knew the truth. The storm had left its mark, not outside but within. And somewhere deep inside, a man who had chosen solitude found himself no longer certain it was what he wanted.